Picture this. You are the most powerful being on the planet. Bullets flatten against your chest like wet paper. You can lift a skyscraper with one hand. You can melt steel with your eyes, and freeze a river with your breath. You fly faster than fighter jets, and land without leaving a mark on the pavement. You are, by every measure, invincible. This is the Superman promise. It has been the same promise since 1938, a being so far beyond human limitation that the laws of nature themselves seem to bend around him. And for decades, that promise has worked, because nobody stops to ask the one question that unravels all of it. Where does the energy come from? Where does the force go? What is the biology that actually makes any of this possible? And what would it cost? Because here is the thing about Superman that the comics never want you to sit with. Every single one of his powers requires something. Energy has to come from somewhere. Force has to be absorbed somewhere. Biology has to be structured in a specific way to produce a specific output. And when you apply the actual laws of thermodynamics, structural mechanics, and physiology to what Clark Kent does on a Tuesday afternoon, the whole architecture collapses. Not because the writers were careless, because what they built is genuinely, categorically, physically impossible. Today we are going to break down 4 of Superman's core powers and explain exactly why each one fails when you hold it against real science. By the end of this video, you will understand why Superman is not just the most powerful superhero ever conceived, he is the most physically incoherent one. Let's start with the most iconic image in comics, a man standing in midair. The flight problem. Every object that flies does so because of one of 3 mechanisms. It generates lift through aerodynamic surfaces, like a bird or a plane. It generates thrust that exceeds gravity, like a rocket, or it manipulates buoyancy by being less dense than the medium it floats in, like a balloon. Superman does none of these things. He has no wings. He has no visible propulsion system. He is not less dense than air. He is described repeatedly in canon as being extraordinarily dense, which is part of what makes him strong. He simply rises into the air and moves in any direction at will, including straight up, which aerodynamic lift cannot produce, and sideways, which rocket thrust cannot produce without a directional exhaust system. For Superman to fly, he would need to generate a force that counteracts gravity and provides directional movement, without any of the physical mechanisms that all known flying objects use to do exactly that. In physics, force does not appear from nowhere. Newton's third law is not optional. Every force requires an equal and opposite reaction. When a rocket rises, the exhaust goes down. When a bird climbs, its wings push air down. When Superman rises into the air, something has to be pushed in the opposite direction, and there is nothing. No exhaust, no downdraft, no visible mechanism of any kind. The comics invented a partial explanation involving the absorption of solar energy, creating some kind of bioelectric field. But a bioelectric field is not a propulsion system. Electricity does not generate lift. The human body already generates a small bioelectric field, and it has never caused anyone to hover. The energy required to levitate a 100-kilogram object against Earth's gravity continuously, and then accelerate it to the speed Superman reaches, would need to come from somewhere measurable, go somewhere observable, and follow the same conservation laws that govern every other physical interaction in the universe. Superman's flight is not a superpower that bends the rules. It is a superpower that requires the rules not to exist. The strength problem. Superman's strength is usually described in terms of what he can lift. In various canon sources, he has lifted objects ranging from tanks to tectonic plates. For the purposes of this video, let us be conservative and focus on one of his more commonly depicted feats, lifting a large building. A mid-size commercial building weighs somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 metric tons, depending on its size and construction. To lift it, Superman would need to apply an upward force exceeding its weight through whatever contact point he is using, typically his hands or outstretched arms. Here is the structural problem. Force does not care about the person applying it. It cares about the material receiving it. When Superman pushes upward on the base of a building with enough force to lift 100,000 metric tons, That force has to travel through the building structure before the building goes anywhere. Concrete and steel have compressive strength limits. The contact point, wherever Superman's hands meet the building, would experience the entire lifting force concentrated in a very small area. The pressure at that contact point would be enough to pulverize the concrete locally before any upward movement occurred. Superman would punch through the building rather than lift it. This is not a hypothetical. It is the same reason cranes have wide lifting platforms and spreader beams. Force concentrated in too small an area destroys the object being moved before it moves it. Superman's hands, regardless of how strong he is, are roughly 200 square centimeters of contact area. Distributing 100,000 metric tons of lifting force through 200 square centimeters produces a pressure that exceeds the compressive strength of reinforced concrete by several orders of magnitude. And this is before we consider what happens to the ground beneath him. Superman has to push against something to generate upward force on the building. That something is the Earth. The pressure his feet would exert on the ground during a maximum strength lift would far exceed the bearing capacity of any surface he could stand on. He would sink into the pavement, then the soil, then the bedrock, driving himself downward while the building went nowhere. The stronger Superman is, the more this problem applies. Peak strength does not solve the contact point problem, it makes it worse. The heat vision problem. Heat vision is presented in the comics as a relatively low-cost power. Superman glances at something and it melts. He uses it casually, briefly, in the middle of fights, apparently without any significant energy expenditure. The thermodynamics disagree. To melt steel, you need to raise its temperature to approximately 1,370 degrees Celsius. To do that from a distance, using directed energy, you need to deliver enough energy to overcome the steel's thermal mass and its rate of heat dissipation into the surrounding environment. The power required to melt even a small steel object from across a room in the time frame the films and comics depict would be measured in megawatts. A megawatt is 1 million watts. A typical human body at peak exertion produces somewhere between 500 and 1,000 watts. Superman's heat vision, operating at melting steel capacity, would require an energy output roughly 1,000 to 2,000 times the maximum output of an entire human body at full exertion, delivered continuously for as long as the beam is active. That energy has to come from somewhere. The comics say it comes from solar radiation, absorbed through Superman's skin. But the amount of solar energy striking a human-sized surface area on Earth's surface is approximately 1,000 watts per square meter under direct sunlight. Superman's total body surface area is roughly 1.9 square meters. His maximum solar absorption rate, even at 100% efficiency, which no biological system achieves, is under 2,000 watts. He would need to sit in direct sunlight for hours just to accumulate the energy required for a single second of heat vision at steel melting intensity. He does not do this. He flies through clouds, operates at night, works indoors, and fires heat vision repeatedly in the same fight sequence. The energy budget does not balance. Not even close. A body trying to generate megawatts of directed energy from a deficit energy store would not fire a clean red beam. It would go into systemic shutdown as every available calorie was consumed in a fraction of a second. The invulnerability problem. Invulnerability is the power that makes everything else feel safe. It is also the power that, when you examine it carefully, makes everything else impossible. For Superman's body to stop bullets, it needs to be harder than the bullet. Hardness in materials science means resistance to deformation. A material that resists deformation under impact does so because its internal structure is rigid, its molecular bonds are strong, and it does not flex when force is applied. This is why diamonds are hard. This is why tungsten can penetrate armor. Hardness and rigidity are the same property. But biological function requires the opposite of rigidity. Muscle tissue generates force by contracting and relaxing. Joints function by allowing controlled deformation under load. Lungs expand and contract. The heart squeezes blood by physically changing shape 60 to 100 times per minute. Every single biological process that keeps a living organism alive depends on tissue that can move, flex, compress, and deform. A body hard enough to stop a bullet is a body whose tissue cannot flex. Muscles that cannot deform cannot contract. A heart that cannot deform cannot beat. Lungs that cannot expand cannot breathe. Superman's invulnerability, applied consistently to his biology, would produce a body that is structurally indistinguishable from a statue. Perfectly preserved. Completely lifeless. The comics solve this with selective invulnerability. The idea that his body is hard when it needs to be, and flexible when it needs to be, but that is not a biological property. That is magic with a scientific name attached to it. No known material and no known biological mechanism can switch between rigid enough to stop a bullet and flexible enough to pump blood based on contextual need. These are mutually exclusive material states, not a spectrum with a convenient middle option. The real conclusion. So here is what you have when you put all four together. A being who flies without any propulsion mechanism that physics recognizes. Who lifts objects his own contact points would destroy before they moved. Who fires energy beams his body could never generate enough power to produce. And whose defining physical characteristic, the invulnerability that makes everything else feel possible, would render every biological process that keeps him alive completely non-functional. Superman is not impossible because the science is hard. He is impossible because each of his powers requires a different fundamental law of physics to simply not apply. Flight requires Newton's third law to not apply. Strength requires material science to not apply. Heat vision requires thermodynamic conservation to not apply. Invulnerability requires the basic mechanics of biological tissue to not apply. Every other superhero breaks one or two rules. Superman requires the entire rulebook to be thrown out simultaneously, and then asks you not to notice. The remarkable thing is that it works. 80 years of readers have not noticed, or have not cared, because the character is not about physics. He is about the idea that power and goodness can exist in the same body. That the strongest thing in the room can also be the most careful with that strength. Physics cannot give us that. But apparently, we needed it badly enough to invent someone who could.